In this video, we'll be taking a look at how you can use modifiers in Blender. Modifiers allows you to work non-destructively and make your work more efficient and easy. So let's see how it's going to work. Let's say that I'm modeling a chocolate bar. And to do that, let's select this object, tap into edit mode, and scale it along the z-axis. And then in the object mode, let's move it up like that. And let's select this top face in the face selection mode, scale it down, move it down a little bit like that. Maybe add an inset and extrude it towards the top like that. Add one tiny sort of extrusion again. So you can see that we added this, but in real life we have our objects that are more soft and rounded, and to do that I have to select my object, select all parts of my object, and then add a bevel. And you can see that it's going to mess up it a little bit. So once I do that, you can see that it's added permanently, and if I need to go a step back, I don't have any option to go back except that I can use Ctrl Z. But let's say that after adding the bevel I modeled this like that. And now if I want to remove that bevel, I don't have any way to go back and remove that. On top of that, let's say that I need to create more pieces of this chocolate to create a chocolate bar. So I'm going to press Alt D so that it's a linked duplicate and move it along the y-axis. And let's just do this more. So Alt D and then along the y-axis. And you can see that the placement isn't so easy to do so. We might use the snapping, but then again, that's an added step. And then let's say something like there. So you can see that it can be really time consuming, and afterwards maybe I want to add more pieces to that. So this is all manual work. Now we can do this much more efficiently by using modifiers. So let's select everything and get rid of it by pressing delete key, and let's add a new cube object. Now we're going to go ahead and scale this again in the object mode. So when you're working with modifiers, something to keep in mind is that if you press N key, make sure that your scale is at 1. Because if you scale your object in the object mode, then it's going to change, and oftentimes you'll get weird artifacts. So if you have you apply a modifier and something isn't working, then make sure to check your scale. So if you have scale modified and you want to move this back to the default value, that's pretty simple. Just go to the object menu, and then down here you should find apply. And then you can apply the scale. I just like to use the keyboard shortcut, so that's Control A and then apply scale. You can also do same thing with location and rotation. So let's apply scale, and that's now even. Let's close our sidebar. So now what we can do is that if I change the shape like that, just like before, like that. So let's say that I want to add those rounded corners. Let's go to this gear icon, and that's where we can add modifiers. Click on add modifier, and we have a few different categories. Under generate, you'll be using most of the time in this generate category. We have a lot of these. Let's start with the first one. So we want to do bevel. Let's go ahead and add that. And you can see immediately we see the changes on our object. And we can bevel our vertices or edges. And then we have the amount. So we can change that. Hold on Shift key while you're doing this so that it's a bit easier. And then you can increase the number of segments. And then we can right click and shade our object smooth so that it's smoother. And you can see that it's a pretty non-destructive way. So we can very easily sort of change and edit these values. Even if I start sort of modifying the shape of my object like that, I can still go back and change any of those values very easily and quickly. Now down here we have the method. By default it bevels every edge that has 30 degrees or more a curve. So in this case, any part of the object which has curve more than a 30 angle, then it's going to bevel those edges. But we have other methods like bevel width that you'll see in the final project for this course, so you can also sort of do it with that. Now something to keep in mind is that when you're using modifiers, the order of the modifiers is important, so anything added at the top will be affected by the bottom one. So you'll start from top and work towards bottom, and you can use this sort of area to drag modifiers up and down. You can collapse the settings so that if you have a lot of modifiers, you can change the name so that to something more descriptive, so that if you come back, you know what this modifier is doing to your object. And then here you have some icons. So you can click on this and it lets you see the changes in the edit mode. So you can turn that off, and then you can also turn that off in the viewport. So if you're not in the edit mode, you can toggle the visibility, so what this modifier is doing to the object. And finally, you can hide that in rendering. And if you click on this drop down, you can apply the modifier, you can create a duplicate of the modifier. And again, you can see that we can move these up and down. You can remove the modifier by clicking here. And one more way to apply this modifier would be hovering your cursor over it and then pressing Ctrl A. Now, when you apply the modifier, all the changes that this modifier is making will be applied or baked into your object. So that would be sort of finalizing your shape. Now you can see that those bevels aren't here, so we just have this single edge. But if we go into object mode, and you can only apply these modifiers in object mode. click on this drop down, apply the modifier, and you can see all those changes are now applied. So now we will have to manually do this if we change our mind later on. So what I like to usually do is that I create a copy of my object, cancel the movement, and hide it in the viewport. Now if I apply the modifier and later down the road I made a mistake and I want to go back, I can just delete this object and turn on that other object that I had. So you can see that it allows you to work very non-destructively. So the bevel modifier allows us to bevel our edges very easily and quickly. Let's go ahead and click on add modifiers and go through some other modifiers. You can click on array modifier. Okay, we have some sort of weird bug. Let's press Ctrl Z and we can do that again. And this should let us do that. Okay, so Blender is acting up a little bit. It often does that when you find sort of glitches, but you shouldn't have this problem. So let's go ahead and increase or decrease the counts. So you can see that we can very easily and okay, let me just see. Okay, I tabbed out and tabbed back in and you can see that it's fixed now. So it was just a simple weird bug. So you can see that I can increase the number of counts I need. And the way to determining which side these bars needs to go is this relative offset. So by default, it's going to go on the x-axis. We can do this to -1 axis and like that. And it's just moving 1 unit sort of relative to itself. And if we increase that, we can sort of increase the gap like that. So it's going to give us even spacing very easily and quickly. And let's say that I don't want to do this on the x-axis, but rather on the y-axis, I can type that in. And just like that. And then we can add more modifiers. So we can sort of stack these. So I'm going to add another modifier, but this time we're going to increase the number of counts on the x-axis. So you can see all of that. And the great thing is that I'm still working on this first object. So if I make any change to this object, maybe I select these vertex points and move them, you can see it applies across all those other copies that are created using modifiers until I have applied these. So let's go ahead and go over some more modifiers. So we have this Boolean modifier, which can be really helpful. Let's go ahead and create 2 cubes object. So we can create one, Shift D to duplicate. So we can use one object as a cutter for the other one. So let's go ahead and select this object, add modifier, and regenerate. We're going to add a Boolean modifier. And that tells us which object we want to use for the Boolean. Let's click on this eyedropper icon, click here, and it's going to cut that object. Now we can't see this because this object is in the way. So let's go to object properties and viewport display, display as, and we can change that to var. And you can see how it's cutting that object. And it's pretty non-destructive. We can select this object, move it around, and you can see how it's cutting through that object. Now we can change the mode of that modifier. So difference means that it subtracts the object. We can unionize, so it's going to combine both objects. We can select intersect, and it's going to only leave the path that is intersecting. Something like that. Let's see what other modifiers that we often use. Another great one is that let's go ahead and hide all of these objects and add in a new cube object. Now this is a very common modifier that often people use. So let's say that I'm modeling a car in Blender. I can go into edit mode, add a loop cut in the center like that, select these vertices on this side and delete them. So now I will only model one half of the object and it's going to apply on the other side automatically. If we go into add modifiers, generate, and add a mirror modifier. Now we can tell it to mirror on the x-axis, we can tell it to be mirrored on the y-axis, and we can also select a mirror object. By default, it's going to use the object origin, so it's going to mirror object on the other side based on this origin point. So in the edit mode, if we move our object, you can see it sort of moves that. And this clipping option is going to make sure so you can't move beyond this sort of merging point. If this is not enabled, then you can sort of do that. So let's enable that. And let's start modeling our object a little bit. So we're going to scale this on the y-axis like that. We can add in a loop cut here, bevel that loop cut without adding any more additional loops in the center. Select this top face, make sure that the clipping is enabled. Otherwise, if we extrude this by pressing E, you can see that these will be individual objects. So make sure that this is enabled, then it wouldn't be like that. And now we can go ahead and scale it slightly like that, move it up. And then let's select this edge, move it to the y-axis. Let's go ahead and select the entire loop. So alt click to, let's shift click on these points like that. And move these on the y-axis like that. And we can do the same thing for the back face. So you can see that I'm just modeling one part of the object and it's sort of applying on the other one. And let's select these bottom faces. So control click over there, move it up like that. And now we can use the Boolean modifier to create the cutout for the vehicle, and to let's also create the windows first. So we're going to add one more loop cut here, select these faces in the face selection mode, and then we can press I to inset, and I again for individual insetting, like that. And then we can extrude these along normals, like that. Let's add in a new object in the object mode. So we're going to add a cylinder object. Let's reduce the resolution by changing the number of vertices to something like 16, so that we have less vertices that we need to rotate. Let's rotate this along the y-axis 90 degrees. And let's go to the front view so we can drag it around more easily, like that. Go to the side view by pressing 3, move it like that, tap into edit mode and scale it down to something like that. Finally, let's go ahead and scale this on the x-axis to make it smaller like that. And then we can go into add modifiers, generate mirror modifier. We can select this car object as the mirroring, and you can see that it creates this on the other side. And then we can also enable this for the y-axis, and it's going to create it over there. Shift D to duplicate so we can create the wheels and the Boolean object. So let's hide this new copy that we just created, and then we go back to our car model, add modifiers, add a Boolean modifier, and select this object. Now we can go to the object properties tab, and then down here under display we can display it as a wire. Let's enable our wheels that we created and hidden, and we can scale it down slightly like that. Tap into edit mode, and we're just going to work on one object, and it's going to apply to all the wheels. So let's press I to inset, E to extrude towards the inside, I to inset again, E to extrude it outwards like that. And for the front side, let's go ahead and select this face, move it down slightly like that, maybe add a bit of bevel with a little bit sort of roundness like that. And let's select this face, let's press Shift D, and we can separate this by selection. So now we have this separate object. So go back into the object mode, select that new object, tap into edit mode, select the entire object, scale along z-axis, and then move it down like that. And then we can extrude it to create the bumper. Select everything again, Shift D to duplicate, and grab it along the z-axis like that. And then go back into the modifiers, disable the clipping, and then enable the X-ray mode by pressing Alt-Z. And in the vertex selection mode, select these vertices, switch back to the normal shading, and grab this along the x-axis to move it like that. And then we can fill this by pressing F key. And then we can do same thing for the back side. So we can sort of move these objects to the back by pressing Shift D, move this along the y-axis like that over there. And you can see that the origin point is somewhere else. So if we have movement tool activated, it's going to show up there. So we can simply right click and set the origin of our object to geometry. And it's going to fix that for us. And here we have this sort of open edge that we can fix very easily. Okay, there's some sort of weird bug happening. Okay, the reason it's happening is that we turned off the clipping option and we combined headlights and bumper together. So we can just delete this, and let's go back to the front side. We can go ahead and select everything and separate by loose parts, and this is going to give us two separate objects. And now we should be able to sort of do that, but first let's enable clipping for the bumper. Select both of these and Shift D to duplicate again, move them along the y-axis like that. And now it shouldn't give us that problem anymore. And again, we can select this face and move it a little bit like that. So we're sort of creating a very rough sort of shape. Let's add a bit more roundness. So you can see how we can sort of use these modifiers. Let's go through some more modifiers. So to generate, we have things like build. It's going to slowly build your object. So let's go ahead and add it. And now you can increase this start frame. So you can see how it sort of builds your object slowly over time. So it's really good for sort of animating the build-up process of your model. And then you have other things like the subdivision modifier. You can click here and it's going to round all the objects. It's going to subdivide your model. To see this better, let's add in a new cube object and move it to the side. And let's press Ctrl 2 and it's going to add a subdivision modifier with level 2. If you press Ctrl 1, it's going to be 1. Ctrl 3 is going to give you 3 levels of subdivisions. And the reason why we use this is that if I go into edit mode, you can see even though this object is very round and smooth, let's right click and shade it smooth in the object mode. So editing this would be much easier. I can just select one face and move it around. But when we apply this modifier, let's click on this icon. and you can see this would be sort of the final geometry of this object. So the reason we use this often is that if you have very organic object, you can still like work on a very small number of vertices. So for example, let's increase this to count to 3, and let's say that I want to change the shape. I can select this face and move this on the x-axis. You can see it's much easier. But if we go ahead and apply this modifier, and now I have to do the same thing. Now every time I want to make a small change, I have to go ahead and select all of these faces, all of these, and then I have to move them. And you can see it's going to give me very weird results. And then I can use the proportional editing, so it lengthens the modeling process. So it's much easier to just use the subdiv modifier as you're working. And once you model the object, then you can just apply this modifier. We have the solidify modifier, which is going to give you a thickness or depth. So let's go ahead and select these objects, delete them, and add in a simple plane object like that. And then you can go into add modifier, you can add solidify modifier, and you can change that. So it's going to give you depth very easily and quickly. You can enable this even thickness. Sometimes when you have different kind of shapes, you might need to enable this function. So these are some of the modifiers that you use regularly. There are a few other ones, like you can bend objects and you can do things like those, but I would recommend you to sort of experiment and play around with those. So that's how you can work with modifiers in Blender.